What you're seeing with this Chinese tech is that it is meeting at the point where people need it the most. Because what you find is that for complete units, the prices may be out of reach for many people, but there is a solution and a price for everyone. I like the way the Chinese approach their matters and issues and business, that whatever brand, you will get it. There is always something that you will get for the price or the affordability, how deep your pocket is.
At the moment, there isn't that much defined charging infrastructure in Kenya, and purely because it's more of a chicken and egg situation. People don't want to set up charging infrastructure because there are no cars. People don't want to bring cars because there's no charging infrastructure.
When Njenga did a story a couple of months ago talking about the Neta V and posted the price that said it was $30,000, a lot of people on YouTube were saying, sorry, you got the price wrong. It can't be that expensive. And then Njenga came back and was like, well, guess what? There's a whole lot of import taxes on these cars.
And the way the tax structure happens in Kenya is the newer the vehicle, the more the taxes, which to me is a bit skewed. So example, if you bring in a vehicle at $20,000 US, you are likely to pay taxes of about 90%. So we are talking about, just to have it in your shop, we're talking about 40K. So if you add your markup, we're talking about 50K just to sell it.
That is crazy.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and today I'm joined for the first time on the show by CGSP's Africa Climate Editor Njenga Hakina, joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. A very good afternoon to you, Njenga.
Hello, Eric. How are you doing?
Well, it's great to have you on the show for the first time. This may be a new voice to our listeners, but you are all over our social media. You're doing these great videos on YouTube. So I think our listeners on YouTube are going to be very excited to hear you because you built up quite a following on YouTube doing a lot of your fantastic videos about climate change and EVs and energy in various parts of Africa. So fantastic to finally have you on the show. It's long overdue.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate every fan that we have interested in what we are doing across the continent.
Well, you have been following the spread of Chinese e-mobility technology. And I say e-mobility in part because in most of the world, people think of the Chinese and mobility in terms of EVs. So we've had a big confrontation between China and Europe and China and the United States over access to those markets, focusing a lot on cars. But in many parts of the world, particularly in the global south, the Chinese are much more engaged in the entire e-mobility supply chain. So all the way from bicycles, tricycles, buses, cars, mopeds, all these different forms of transportation at every price point too, going from, things that farmers in Africa are using all the way up to very expensive cars. Let me just bring everybody up to date on what's been happening over the past, say, 6 or 7 months, even the past year, and why this is becoming such an interesting topic and why Njenga in particular is focusing on this. These are just a few of the headlines right before the show I put together just to give you a sense of the pace that things are starting to pick up with respect to what the Chinese are doing across the continent. And many of the brands that I'm going to say, for most listeners, they're going to be like, what? Who are these brands? They're completely unfamiliar, but in China, there are something like 34 or 40, different EV brands. Many of them are not finding profitability in the domestic market, so they're going abroad. They can't go to countries like the United States. They are finding it difficult to get into South Korea, into Japan. So that's one of the reasons why Africa now is a potential growth market for Chinese EVs. Take a listen to this list of headlines. Neta Auto, we're going to talk about Neta. They opened a new flagship store in Nairobi in June. The EV maker NIO signed a joint venture in October in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, with an Emirati firm to launch sales and service in the MENA region. Xpeng also launched in Egypt this year. BAIC, which is one of the largest state-owned Chinese automakers, I mean, they're absolutely huge. They opened up a new flagship store in Cairo this year. BYD, back in January, announced that it was opening Rwanda, which, if I recall, is going to be its third market in Africa after South Africa, in Zimbabwe. And BYD is also building out the charging network in Tunisia. So you start to see these scatter points of headlines across the continent. It's not just now in sales and service that they're also expanding. Production is coming to the continent as well. Now, the Chinese have been building cars, internal combustion engine cars, in South Africa for a very long time. But now EVs are starting to be built in Africa. First Automotive Works, again, another state-owned enterprise, announced a new production deal in Egypt. And we're starting also to see expansion in other sectors as well, particularly in the bus sector, and this is going to be a focus of our conversation today in Kenya. There's a company called Bazigo in Kenya and also another one called Rome, both of them using BYD buses and BYD technology. So it's happening at all these different levels. And Njenga, I just put a few dots on the map there. You've been looking at this more closely. Tell us a little bit about the overview of Chinese mobility technology, green mobility technology specifically, in different parts of the continent and how entrepreneurs are using these technologies to really pioneer new businesses.
Yeah, so apart from, like some of the things that you've mentioned here, you will notice that the numbers, in no particular order that I'm sharing here, is that you will have about like 6,000 EVs in South Africa by 2020. That is the latest that they had in terms of research that they did. This is Motor. And you realize that across, the continent in Morocco, the EV fleet also grew to about 10,000 by 2023. And like you've mentioned, it is as Chinese companies are seeking to expand outside of the countries where they have been sanctioned. And so if we may look at a country like Kenya, it is not just that we are coming in to sell. We are also bringing in some aspects of technology whereby we are going to build something from the ground up. And so you have mentioned e-bikes, you have mentioned tricycles, you've mentioned all those things. And what is happening across this is that we are not seeing, apart from Ethiopia, which has a policy on, like having EVs come in big numbers. The other countries across Africa are not doing that. And so what you're finding is that there are many small entities, like almost like cottage industries, but focused and around EV, which are doing something. So they are doing stuff from e-bikes, they are retrofitting bikes, old vehicles. We have the buses that are coming in, and even the vehicles that are being used by having solar as one of the directly charging. We had one of those last year where we focused at a car that was really small. They were using solar directly to charge that car. Then there was no need to plug that in. So what you're seeing with this Chinese tech is that it is meeting at the point where people need it the most and most affordably, to say, because what you find is that for complete units, the prices may be out of reach for many people, but there is a solution and a price for everyone. I like the way the Chinese approach their matters and issues and business, that whatever brand, you will get it. There is always something that you will get for the cost or the affordability, how deep your pocket is.
Well, give us a couple examples here. There's a company in Ghana called Solar Taxi that is bringing in Chinese solar panels and then using those to charge the cars and selling those as a package. You also talked about how there's a Chinese firm in Nairobi that is taking old gas engine motorbikes and putting electric engines into them. Give us some of the examples of what entrepreneurs are doing across the continent in this space that's really starting to take shape.
The innovators in this space are not just looking at what can we bring in from China and sell as complete units, They are also looking at how do we plug in the gaps. So in Kenya, for instance, there are a number of companies and individuals and innovators who are retrofitting vehicles. We have had a Mercedes-Benz that has been retrofitted to become electric. We've seen Porsche, I've seen Touaregs, and those are brands that are not Chinese, but they are being retrofitted with Chinese tech. And so really small, but something that is having an impact across the EV space. If you move to a country like Nigeria, you will find that the inroad into that market using Chinese tech is they are bringing in EVs that are being used for taxi services or for moving services, whichever way you look at it, logistics, in terms of like vans and moving trucks. So what is happening is when you look at the people who are coming with these solutions, it is because they have seen the needs. And so across Africa, you will find these are being targeted at the very pain points that have not been addressed by either government policy or by, the big companies that have been there for a while, including the fossil fuel vehicles. And we have big brands that are here, but the needs, the costs, and the practicality of using this technology is what is creating and moving these innovations.
Well, let's get a perspective now from a leading expert in the field. And I've been just so looking forward to our discussion today with Alex Mwanzo, who is the general manager of Equator Mobility, which is part of the investment holding company Maris Africa. Let's just say he's been in the EV space for a very long time, and he brings a lot of technical knowledge. He's both a EV engineer, and he's got degrees also as a lithium battery engineer. So, Alex, you are definitely the right person to speak with today about this fascinating topic, and thank you for joining us from Nairobi.
Thank you so much, Eric. Happy to be here as well. Thank you for the introduction. I've been here for quite a bit. I think this is my 7th or 8th year in doing EV stuff. So yeah, it's interesting space to be in and happy to chat about that as well.
Well, help us put this into some perspective. We want to take advantage of all these years that you've been in the space. Last year, about 1 million cars were sold in Africa. About half of that volume was in South Africa alone. The EV market is estimated to be worth today around $205 million, which is pretty modest overall. So the market is quite young right now in Africa, and there's a lot of potential there. But talk to us about how we should understand and frame this market and this potential.
Africa is a very interesting market because, number one, obviously because of just the demographic, is the affordability of EVs is not as great as somewhere, say, in the West. However, we sort of tend to pick technology really fast. So if you just compare that with something like M-Pesa, mobile payments and things like that. So we kind of leapfrog into technology really fast. The beauty is most of the OEM manufacturers, they've sort of been sluggish to go into EVs. So, your BMWs, your Toyotas. So example would be Africa is a Toyota sort of market. However, they've been slow into that market. So when China has come into the equation and they're offering better cars, which are, let me just say, cheaper and would perform really well, Africa has really opened up to say, we can actually buy EVs which are cheaper and better than what we've used to. So if you look at the last 5 years, it has sort of been doubling. For Kenya, we started with like 5 cars a year. Right now, we're doing like 200 cars a year. We are almost aiming at 1,000 vehicles next year. And more companies are now actually coming and say Africa is now an actual market for new cars. And more Africans are warming into now purchasing new cars, especially from China.
So cars may be slow to pick up because of a lot of factors in terms of import taxes, charging networks, and the high cost of some of the cars. But Njenga's been talking about tricycles and scooters and motorcycles. How much potential do you see that taking off? Because in countries where I am here in Southeast Asia, it's the motorbike that is the main mode of transportation for a lot of people. And Chinese electric mobility in that space might actually be quite useful because the price point is significantly lower.
It's exactly the same for Africa in that the electric two-wheelers is what's most affordable for most. It's what most can also afford. And when most of these OEMs are coming into the country, we're talking about 1,000 or 2,000 just for acquisition. And that's really good, especially in a country where people are cash sensitive, right? So take, for example, if you normally travel 50 kilometers a day, you need about 5 liters of fuel to do that trip. If that changes into, you only need about a unit or two of electricity, which is 80% cheaper, then it starts to make sense. Because in Africa, the climate conversation comes after I've saved a bit of money into my pocket. Most of the EV that will come into Africa will not be because it's good for the climate, but it will be good for the pocket. And that's where it hits the right notes, so to speak.
That's true. And climate change is a big deal when it comes to these issues and conversations around e-mobility and EV tech. And you realize that when you look at the adoption, it happens after I have made my savings, which is okay. But when you look at the reality on the ground is that the effects are hitting us the hardest. If you go to the petrol station today, before you fill up your car, you will have to dig deeper than you would have 5 or 10 years ago. Today, we are paying more for every single basic service that we need, including consumption of fuel. And so we cannot kind of dissociate or divorce climate change from some of these. And I know that there are people who are moving from fossil fuel vehicles to EVs because there are savings in there. It is an issue of climate change because it has also affected the amount of money people are able to save. It has affected the way people look at life and the way they look at the future in terms of how do I make it to tomorrow? I mean, how do I stretch my, dollar to go longer and further because we cannot be assured of how tomorrow will be like. And we have seen events happening also when either there are droughts or there are like crazy rains happening. And all these are contributing to how we are able to adapt and deal with the issues. And so EV tech is coming in to plug into this. But if I may ask Alex, when you look at our understanding and our connection or disconnect of climate change and our activities, including some of the resources that we are using, the fuels that we are using, and how we drive even, do you see like people are able to connect? Or is there still that kind of denial? It is not happening. It is not there. Well, this is a creation of some people out there.
So there is that disconnect, and I think it's just more of an education part of things because most people think, climate change is something that is only, a reserve for the West because, they're more industrialized, they drive more cars, they buy new cars, all those things. But if you look at Kenya, even in the ecosystem itself, there are industries here, there's the infrastructure here, and it's just more of an education in saying there is climate change happening. And that climate change is also affecting us and, in our everyday lives, right? So take an example is that we have major roads in Kenya, massive traffic, 2-hour traffic jams and things like that. It's just telling them that we need to start, driving better to work or, carpooling and things like that so that we reduce the sort of emissions that are coming out of our vehicles to the environment because that will just affect, even the weather itself. We've seen Kenya, we've gone up 3 degrees in the last 10 years, just ambient temperature in Nairobi alone. So if you explain that to people now, it starts to make a lot of sense.
It makes a lot of sense, Alex, but it doesn't feel like the Kenyan government and other African governments are helping this cause. When Njenga did a story a couple of months ago talking about the Neta V and posted the price that said it was $30,000, a lot of people on YouTube were saying, sorry, you got the price wrong. It can't be that expensive. And then Njenga came back and was like, well, guess what? There's a whole lot of import taxes on these cars. Again, Ethiopia is the only country. So talk about the obstacles.
The problem with importation of vehicles to Kenya is, to be honest, it's skewed. So by skewed, it means it's basically double. So if you buy a vehicle today, you're paying almost 2x in taxes. So that makes the price go really high. And unfortunately, the newer the vehicle, the higher the taxes as well. So that's where the problem is coming in. The government is saying a lot, but government is doing really little just to push this sort of conversation, right? So example is there was a talk about 50,000 EVs in Kenya by 2025. 2025 is like 4 months away. We're barely at 5,000, so less than 10% of that. And the way the tax structure happens in Kenya is the newer the vehicle, the more the taxes, which to me is a bit skewed. So example, if you bring in a vehicle at $20,000 CIF Mombasa, you are likely to pay taxes of about 90%. So we are talking about, just to have it in your shop, we're talking about 40K. So if you add your markup, we're talking about 50K just to sell it. And then keep in mind, again, Kenya is a second-hand market. People just go to Japan and bring a vehicle at 80 years old. And it's not because they cannot afford a new car. They're just trying to beat the tax by what it has been designed for, right? So the weak point to the tax is the older the vehicle, the lesser the taxes. So most people would rather just go to China, Japan, UK, and import vehicles at 8 years old, and then they pay maybe 20% in taxes. So the same vehicle that's 8 years old, they'll buy it at probably 10K USD and pay $2,000 in taxes. So that's why.
And is that the same in other African countries as well?
So I know South Africa is different, and that's even why South Africa is growing the way it's growing. So one, South Africa has just completely banned importation of second-hand vehicles, right? And if you bring in a second-hand vehicles, you're slapped with almost 200% in taxes. So that just tells people you actually need to buy new cars, and the tax for new cars are slightly lower. So you go to South Africa, even major OEMs, guys from China, BYD, BMW, have assembly lines in South Africa itself just because there is a market for people to buy new cars because the government has allowed that. So for Kenya, that stifling for the government is what is making things not grow as fast, but we hope that will change.
And Njenga, what other obstacles are you seeing that are blocking the adoption of EVs? Talking everything from charging networks to inconsistent power supplies. What are some of the challenges that are preventing EVs from taking off?
I think when it comes to the charging infrastructure, it's very limited, very few people who can access it. And for those who can afford, when you look at the power costs, it becomes inhibitive that you cannot afford to be charging your car in the house because the power bills that hit you at the end of that month, you may have to auction that car. So that is one of the biggest challenges. Actually, access to energy, access to electricity is one of those. And then there is the issue of cost. I remember we spoke with one guy who decided, well, I am doing away with my fuel car, petrol car, to be using electric cars. But then looking at the price of that car, you cannot just get that money from your pocket and give the dealer and you take the car away. So what he did is that he organized to swap. The cost of fuel is what he pays installments until he clears payment for that car. So you look at the cost of these vehicles and then you see why it is kind of locking most people out of this. And I think with what Alex has mentioned in terms of the taxation, because when you're paying like 90% in taxes, it means that, well, I'd rather not give this government my money. Let me just continue Ubering or something like that. So cost is one of the biggest hindrances to accessing EVs because when you look at the punitive nature of bringing in a new car into a country like Kenya, and then it is easier for me to import a second-hand car, which has been used elsewhere for, in Kenya, the requirement is not more than 8 years. So it has been used out there for 8 years. Then you can see what this is doing even to our economy because we cannot get to build anything for ourselves. We have to always keep relying on the second-hand stuff. So the cost and then the access to the financing, because also that comes in. It's a big deal. I know this is arranged between dealers and the financials like the banks and all that. But the biggest hindrance that remains is the government policy when it comes to taxation.
And Alex, we're looking beyond EVs. We're also seeing buses. So we talked about Basigo, and then there's Rome, but this is now happening in many parts of Africa that BYD and other Chinese bus technology companies are starting to have an impact. So maybe cars will not be the thing that takes off in Africa, but other modes of transportation. What are you seeing?
The thing about EVs in Africa is just predictability, and that's where it can start from, right? So take an example, a bus. Nairobi in its form, it's about 50 kilometers end to end, however side you look at. So the reason why buses are taking a lot of the cake is just because there is predictability. So you're picking people from point A, dropping them at point B, and then charging it at probably point B, and then going back to point A. So that predictability is really simple to develop charging infrastructure, to develop support for that ecosystem. It's just simpler as opposed to, your common four-wheelers, which take an Uber for an example. You pick someone at, say, Nairobi, they want to go 25 kilometers the other side. And then if you take them that side and someone picks a trip to 25 kilometers farther, it's really tricky for even people who are doing charging infrastructure to sort of map out this because of that unpredictability. And then buses make more sense now because one, you're carrying a lot of people. Buses are also quite expensive in general. And the way the bus infrastructure has been set up in Kenya is you cannot import a second-hand bus. So everyone who wants to buy a bus today has to buy it brand new. So that in its sense just allows more people to now start looking into EVs in terms of capex. So the capital expenditure to just purchase the bus and the operating expenditure to actually operate the bus against a diesel comparative bus. So most people are starting to warm up to buses, and then that will not trickle down into four-wheelers. So like you said, buses will take majority of the cake. And then as people interact more with electric buses, things will be simpler, spiraling it down. Because if you look at Kenya, we have a culture called matatu culture. So these are heavily graffitied buses, heavy music, and things like that. But there is a segment of Kenyans who just want to drive really quietly to work. And then if now you start including things to do with tech, So the reason why most EV buses are now starting to become better and most people are preferring them is because of that predictability of these buses. So you can easily log into an app and then when the bus will come, as opposed to going, in Kenya they're called stages, so it's where you stop and wait for a bus to come. But now you can now start booking a seat, you can even pay monthly, and then once you introduce the tech side of things become slightly better, and that's why the bus would grow.
So in Njenga, Alex talked about the matatus, these minivans, if for people who are not familiar with them, and those guys just drive fast and crazy. They're like Formula One drivers. I mean, they're just, because they got to move. The more people they carry, the more money they make. So they're hustling. Now, in Nairobi, they're still using traditional gas engines, and a lot of those are Toyotas, right? I mean, the Toyotas are the most popular ones.
Yes,
but we're starting to see in Njenga in South Africa that they're using new generation of matatus. I don't know what they call them in South Africa, but that is a potential change, that we could see across the continent in many different ways, using e-mobility for the matatus, these minivans.
So the latest that has come from South Africa in terms of public transportation is eCamva. And it is a very new kind of service. And interestingly, just like Kenya, they have vans which mass move people. I remember when I was there last, they had similar matatus. Actually, the vans are just what you would find in Kenya, moving people just the same way. But now they are shifting to EVs, and it's a company called Flex EV in Johannesburg. And what they are doing is that they have gotten complete units from China, and they are using this to transition from fossil fuel or petrol fuel or diesel fuel in public transport to EVs. And what this does, and I think it is the same thing with us, Alex, is when it comes to mass movement of people, when they become reliable, they become consistent, you find that even the pricing becomes more predictable. Because what you find with diesel fuel matatus in Kenya or the petrol fuel ones is that in case there is some kind of instability in fuel markets, this trickles down to the customer. And so you'll find that the fares are doubling and people will choose to not pay the extra and walk some distance because they basically cannot afford it. And so I think when we look at the EVs in public mobility, it is becoming more predictable. You can book ahead of time and it is reliable. I remember that in Kenya we had a company that was offering this kind of booking for matatus, whereby you just get to book your matatu, when it is coming, it picks you, and then you get to co-share the costs and the ride. And I think when we have this kind of continuity, and that I know it will be here at 10 a.m., I will not miss my bus, then we can also tell that even the other aspects of this public mobility will change. And this includes cost. This includes reliability. This includes the fact that we can tell that government will have to move where the money is moving.
Well, let's close our discussion looking ahead, Alex, and tell us a little bit what your crystal ball tells you about the future of this market. What are you talking to your clients in terms of the future of e-mobility in Africa, and particularly the role of Chinese tech in all of that?
In the right realm of things and right government support, I see going the Ethiopian way of completely banning ICE vehicles, but for a certain period of time, or completely allowing EVs to come in tax-free just to sort of build the infrastructure. Like Njenga said, at the moment, there isn't that much defined charging infrastructure in Kenya, and purely because it's more of a chicken and egg situation. People don't want to set up charging infrastructure because there are no cars. People don't want to bring cars because there's no charging infrastructure. But we're seeing a place whereby most OEMs, most fuel operators, so your Shells, your Total Energies, your Rubies, they started to develop charging infrastructure at their petrol station because they're seeing it as a revenue stream for their associate businesses in their petrol station. For example, if you go into a Tesla to charge, you'll probably need an hour. So, you'll have to sit at the coffee shop. You'll have to do something and shop at their stores and all these things. But Chinese tech is really revolutionizing this because one, they're coming in at cheaper, way, way cheaper. So it's a slight markup from buying a second-hand car, about 20% more. But you're getting a newer vehicle that has way more features than what you'd buy. This car's also coming in on warranty. And I'm actually visiting China, I think on the 9th of December, because more and more OEMs have reached out to Kenya and say, we want to distribute our cars in Kenya and East Africa at large. So looking ahead, I see this movement in Kenya for EVs being pushed a lot by just Chinese EVs being accessible and affordable in Kenya, because people have already warmed up to, these cars don't need maintenance. And then logistics from China to Kenya has really been perfected over time. So in case you need spare parts, that can be shipped in like 4 days. So that has really helped to grow this ecosystem. So looking forward, a lot of Chinese cars coming in, government loosening up their grip on just taxes on EVs. I also see more and more people coming to develop associate infrastructure to do with charging systems, service infrastructure, and even end-of-life applications. So once these vehicles die at the end of life, what will happen to the batteries? They'll go into, solar applications and things like that. So it looks really bright at the right conditions.
Have you been to China before?
No, this will be my first time.
Okay, you are going to be blown away. I mean, because if you want to see what the future of an EV world looks like, go to Shenzhen. I don't know, are you going to Shenzhen or Beijing? Where are you going?
I'll be to Shanghai, then Shenzhen.
Okay, Shenzhen now, you can't get a license plate for an ICE car. The government doesn't give it to you anymore. So you're on the streets of Shenzhen, every motorbike, every bus, every car, and it sounds just like whew, whew. There's no traffic noise other than just the whoosh of the cars. I mean, you are going to lose your mind when you go to Shenzhen. And you see this world that has the future. I mean, when you go to Shenzhen, you see what it can be like when you have almost an entirely electrified transport system. It is really quite something remarkable. In fact, we're going to make a note that we want to talk to you after you come back and to get your impressions of what you thought of when you were in China, in Shanghai and in Shenzhen. That would be a lot of fun. And maybe we'd love to even call you when you're there just to be like, Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, one of my bosses has been to China and I think he was in Shenzhen actually. So there was stuck at this 3-hour traffic jam and it was so silent that it was weird. Guys started to talk to each other. It's no longer noisy in traffic. It was quite funny, considering the noise of traffic.
Yeah, and Nairobi's a lot like Ho Chi Minh City where I live, which is just packed with buses and motorbikes and cars, and it's just loud. And so we've talked about the pollution that comes out of these vehicles in terms of greenhouse gases, but noise pollution is another part of it. And so that's another part of all this. I mean, it's just so loud. So I'm really excited to get your feedback on that. But Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Alex Mwanzo is the general manager of Equator Mobility, which is part of the investment holding company Maris Africa. And as you can hear, one of the smartest guys out there on the EV sector in Kenya and Africa. And we're looking forward to following up with you during and after your trip to China in December.
Thank you so much.
Njenga, what a treat for us to be able to speak with Alex. I've been looking for somebody for a long time who can talk about the burgeoning EV sector in Africa. But again, I want to try to really make sure that we don't just focus on electric vehicles in terms of cars, because I really believe that the innovation that we're going to see is in all of these other ways related to mobility. Again, we talked about tricycles, and I'm not sure that people who live in the US or Europe or Japan understand what we mean by a tricycle. It's not a kid's tricycle. Here in Vietnam and in Kenya and in Zimbabwe and many other places, the tricycle is a 3-wheeled kind of workhorse of a vehicle that is used in rural communities. Here in Saigon, it's used as a way to move people, transport things. Vendors use them. I mean, they're everywhere, but they're slow. They belch a lot of pollution. They have terrible engines. They're often very old. And so using electrification to transition from those dirty, old, sputtering engines into something that is much faster, much more reliable, could have a very profound impact on rural communities.
When we electrify the mobility logistics for rural communities, we mean that we are reducing the costs for them on fuel and other kind of maintenance aspects of these vehicles. Because what is happening with the Chinese EVs that I have experienced here in Kenya is that you don't need as much maintenance as you would a fuel vehicle, like a petrol vehicle or diesel vehicle. And also in terms of fueling, you just need to plug it in, charge it, and you're good to go. For instance, let me give an example of if I spent 1,000 shillings today on fuel, I'll get about maybe like 5 liters of petrol. These 5 liters will probably take me for at most, maybe 70 kilometers. And that's a very exaggerated estimation. But if I spent the same 1,000 on charging my car, then this will take me maybe double, triple that. And you see the kind of savings that we are talking about. Remember that the rural communities are the ones who do not have huge incomes. And so these savings are really enormous to them, and they mean a lot. So when we are talking about electrification of the mobility systems, then we are talking the right things about making economies work, even for the smallest contributor to the economies that are in Africa.
But we cannot understate the obstacles that government is putting up, as we talked about in terms of the Kenyan government really making the incentive to bring in old internal combustion engine cars rather than bring in new, cleaner electric vehicles. Also, this question of the power supply. So there's been massive load shedding in South Africa for quite some time. Now it's happening in Zambia, in Zimbabwe. Nigeria struggled with consistent power. So we really can't see the emergence of a robust e-mobility sector in some parts of the continent until this question of the electricity supplies are stabilized.
True. And because you have a number of points in that, let me start with the electricity. And you realize that a country like Kenya, most of our electricity is renewable, 80%. But when we have droughts, then that reduces by a huge factor. And so unless we are able to stabilize and say we can consistently have this much electricity as is needed, regardless of whatever seasons we are in, then it remains a problem. Because if we are going to ration electricity for like 12 hours a day, and maybe this is when I need to be charging my vehicle, then it means this kind of brings another aspect of the EVs that people do not want to see. And the reality is, unless governments address this issue of making sure that there is accessible energy to everyone, electricity for everyone, then it's going to be a big deal in the adoption of EVs. The other aspect that you brought on was in terms of bringing in old vehicles that have been used elsewhere. Now, in Kenya, what you realize is that the people who are in these businesses are also politicians. And so since they are making something from the inefficiencies of policy, they become lethargic and sluggish in implementing policies that would hasten the adoption of EVs, which would cut them out of all, the money that they are making. And so we also have to look at who is running these sectors to understand why policy will not work. In terms of countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, Ethiopia, we see that South Africa and Ethiopia are like classic examples of what success could look like. But you find that again, across the continent, many other countries will not take that approach because they are going to hurt so many people who are, kind of controlling this fossil fuel vehicle sector that they don't want to be on the wrong side because of the political financing and things like that. But when we talk about the shifts that need to happen, like I said, they will happen whether or not the government will have these policies in place. Because what you're having is this small segment of people and innovators who are coming up with solutions. Like I mentioned, in Zimbabwe, we have Mobility for Africa. And what they're doing is that they're using these e-tricycles and they're making them electric. And so what this does, like I mentioned earlier, is the savings the farmers are making, they motivate them to continue going. And so what will happen is, even if the government improves or they bring in the policies that will favor the shift, the industries and the people and the innovators who are, not at the government level kind of policy making, they will continue innovating and coming up with solutions that matter to them. And what will happen is that the government will be late to catch up. And so what they will be doing is they will be creating laws that are catching up instead of enabling this movement that needs to be done now.
Well, this is such an exciting sector because it's going to be changing so quickly. Now, you're embarking on a new project that I think people are going to find very interesting, where we're going to create an African tracker that shows all of Chinese EV engagement and e-mobility engagement across Africa. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
So the tracker is working on bringing in every aspect of EVs that is happening across the continent. So be it the new vehicle assembly announcement, be it car sales, be it the dealerships and things like that. So this information, we are putting it together in a data map kind of, whereby we are going to be able to point that this is what is happening in Kenya, this is happening in Nigeria, this is happening in Uganda, etc. And it is across the spectrum of the EVs. It could be processing something that is being used for the EV shift. It could be maybe battery manufacturing. It could be vehicle assembly. And like I've mentioned, the sales and all that. So we are hoping to have this as soon as maybe sometime early next year. But the data is coming on really nice. And it's a beautiful thing when you kind of visualize it.
And if you'd like to see the kind of work that Njenga produces, go check out his China Africa Energy Tracker that's now available on the site. Just go to our navigation. You'll see a link for data tools, and there's a drop down there, and it says China Africa Energy. That is a fascinating new energy map that Njenga worked on, and he's going to work now on another one coming out next year about all of this e-mobility issues. So Njenga, thank you so much for joining us today. So exciting to have you as part of the podcast team now. Looking forward to having you back. And if you guys listening at home want to support the work that Njenga is doing, as well as Jero and Cobus, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. That's the best way you can support the work we're doing to provide fact-based, independent journalism on all aspects of Chinese engagement in Africa and around the world, specifically on topics like e-mobility, which again, very few others are covering. And the level of detail that Njenga brings to his reporting, you just don't find anywhere else. But it doesn't come for free. So we also want to thank our Patreon supporters, because without their support, this work could not be possible. So a big, big thank you to everybody on Patreon. If you'd like to join our Patreon community, please go to the show notes and you will see a link to our Patreon page, and we really appreciate all that support. Finally, if you are a student or a teacher and you'd like to sign up for a subscription, we offer half-off subscription rates. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a link to those half-off subscriptions. So for Njenga Hakina in Nairobi, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.